This glorious looking thing is the NZXT Kraken Elite 360 RGB, which is V2, the 2024 edition, with an absolutely immense display. Huge, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn here with my review of the Kraken Cooler. I'm going to talk to you about the various things of interest and some of the quirks of it that include the issues you might have with controllers, RGB lighting sync, and more. I'm also going to do some thermal performance testing in the HAVN HS420 VGPU, which I'll leave at the end of the video, and I'm going to do a separate review on that case, but that's another story. Now, the Kraken Elite 360 RGB is an upgrade to the previous models, and one that's pretty interesting because it comes with NZXT's own pump, but a reworked system for the wiring as well. You'll see there's a port on the radiator now, and most of the wires are hidden away inside there and in the tubes, and so we don't have any cables coming out of the pump itself. If we look at a previous Kraken Elite, for example, you'll see there's some slight differences in the design of the radiator, and obviously the tubes are thicker, and the pump head itself is significantly larger, not only taller, but bigger and more striking. It has less bezel and more screen, which ends up making it look magnificent, as you saw from the beginning of this video. It has some very nice highlights in terms of the customization of what you can do on the display as well, which I'll show you in a little while. Now, the Kraken coolers have been a favourite of mine for a long time because they run quietly. But obviously this is a bit different now because it's using NZXT's own technology and an interesting thought process in the design. It includes, for example, the F360 RGB core fan, so that single frame fan, which only requires 4 screws to mount it to the radiator. You're then left with a load of extra screws you don't need. Now, I've done a full wiring and setup guide video on this that I'll link to in the description, but here I want to talk to you about the quirks of it and also some of the highlights. One of which is this breakout cable, which includes everything you need to connect the AIO to your system. It's an all-in-one system, which means there's no fuss or worry about extra controllers, and everything's pretty straightforward. The fans are controlled via this cable, as is the pump and the display, and it all connects together in one setup. So you don't actually need to use NZXT's fans throughout the case if you don't want to, and you don't need to use single frame fans throughout the case if you don't want to, as I'll show you in a second. The wiring setup is pretty straightforward. You do need SATA power for it, and it needs to be connected to the motherboard USB connection, but it's very easy to wire this into your system. It's also flexible because it will work with LGA 1700 socket motherboards, 1851, and obviously AMD, AM4, and AM5 processors as well. So it's pretty easy to use across a variety of them. Comes with pre-applied thermal paste, and installs quite simply. What I noticed immediately when I went to install it is just the sheer size of the thing. You'll see I've got 4 sticks of RAM and it's not interfering with those, so that's not a problem, but it's definitely large and very striking, and definitely the nicest looking Kraken cooler that I've seen. Once you get it set up, you can put a number of things on the display in NZXT's CAM software, as I'll show you in a second, and obviously have temperature readouts, load readouts, and more in there, and easily set that up. Now, there is one thing to note that I've discovered, thanks to someone on my Discord pointing this out. I didn't notice it immediately, but if you are using NZXT's fans, you might find you can't match things up properly. So the RGB lighting options on the standard single fans that I have in here, which are connected via the older style controller that you can see here. So these are the RGB core fans, not the single frame fans, but the standard fans in this case are connected to this controller. They don't have as many RGB lighting options, or they don't have the same lighting options as the F360 RGB core fan that's on the RAD. I think that's important to point out because if you're trying to select the same options on the fans as in the case as on the radiator, you might not be able to do it. And I spoke to NZXT about this, and apparently they're looking to retrospectively update the firmware on these older controllers so that it will work in the future. But for now, you might want to consider the new Control Hub, which I've done a separate video on. This Control Hub will give you access to similar fan RGB lighting effects, and this is new and improved, and it works with the F360 RGB core fans and the 280s, and it will also work with the older NZXT fans as well, so it has multiple different connections on it. I've done a wiring guide on this controller if you'd like to see that. I'll link to in the description as well. it does require PCIe power, so it's actually a bit more complicated than the previous controllers, but it is very capable and easy, especially if you're using multiples of these single frame fans throughout your case, because you can plug them directly into it. But you don't need it for the Kraken cooler, it's important to note. I just wanted to point out the issues that you might have with the RGB lighting if you're not using it and you're trying to get it sync up. But it will work with the older fans as well, so you could potentially do that depending on how many fans are in your system. Obviously, there are RGB effects that do match. You can see Spectrum Wave, for example, is on both the RGB fans on the radiator and on the core fans, despite the controller difference. And if you use the lighting sync options at the top, you can definitely synchronize from various different lighting effects, but they're limited. So there's just variety between the two in this setup. And I thought it was worth pointing out that you won't necessarily be able to sync them all in the setup currently until the firmware update comes. Now for some thermal testing performance, we're going to do benchmarking and standard game performance. So I started using Intel's Extreme Tuning utility, and you can see under 100% load here, you get a display readout of about 68 degrees on the CPU. Now I want to note that usually I don't do thermal testing on an AIO for review purposes because it's going to vary wildly depending on your CPU, your case, your BIOS, and all sorts of other things. But I thought it'd be interesting to give you some highlights here. So this is an i9 processor, the 13900K. You can see under that testing, the package got up to 84 degrees C, which actually isn't too bad for XTU because it does put it under a lot of pressure. For more real-world testing, just for gaming purposes, I was playing Icarus, which is a space survival simulator that I'm thoroughly enjoying at the moment and is actually very beautiful. And generally speaking, the performance here was good as well. You can see we're getting about 49, 50 degrees C on the CPU under load there. And obviously you've got those readouts at a glance as well, so you can see if there are any issues. And this is one of the nice things about the Kraken coolers, just being able to easily see the temperatures of your various different devices and know whether there's any problem. So gaming here, putting it through its paces, I've been testing it with a variety of games, but this has been my mainstay for a little bit. And so we can see here, we're looking at around a maximum of 75 degrees C. Varies, obviously, from game to game, but that's at the top end. So that's obviously when it's spiked. It's not constantly like that. Then I did OCCT as a benchmark on there for an hour. This was testing there. You can see it has some issues. Obviously, the 13th and 14th gen processors have had some problems, but we've done some BIOS updates. And now the maximum temperature I got here was 85 degrees C or 87 on the package. And again, not too terrible for an i9 processor. And it was running pretty quiet during this testing. I think it's important to point that out, and you'll hear that for yourself in a second when I'll show you a sound test of it as well. Now, in terms of the display in NZXT's CAM software, there are a lot of different options that you can choose between and select. We have various different ones, from simple things like a clock interface to an audio-visual one, which just changes what it does based on the sound that you're listening to, whether that's game audio or music. So you've got some nice reactive effects in there. You can obviously adjust the brightness, as you can see. You can select a carousel. So if you don't want to choose the single or dual infographic or triple infographic, or you can't decide what you like the look of, you can actually select multiple different ones and then get it to go through that. I personally like tweaking the little things. So, for example, you can adjust the colors of the GPU and CPU temperature readouts, so you can see at a glance what's what. I've got Intel set to blue, NVIDIA set to green, obvious for the brand colors, purple for the liquid temperature, so I know it's NZXT's, and then it'll just cycle between those. You can choose the length of time spent on that. But one of the things you will notice is obviously the display is nice and large. If you've looked at the previous Kraken coolers, it's a much bigger display here. It goes a lot more to the edges, a lot more a screen versus bezel, and then you've got the lighting ring around the outside as well, which has various different effects and colors to it, and it just ends up looking really nice. Now, it fits really nicely in this build and looks pretty magnificent, but what I want to do here is just give you a test of gaming and benchmarking with me being completely silent, so you can hear just how loud it is, which is not very loud at all.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.